let's see, any other technical things? Dee is asking if this is the same workshop as, and maybe you're thinking of Alex's. This workshop's a bit different, but Dee, we did talk about the preparations a lot in both sessions, and I would recommend listening to this one too. Stuart, as a farmer, has some really useful things to share. And so he's going to give additional information. It's the third part in a series today. So this is the third of 3 sessions that develop along the same topic of becoming biodynamic. Good. I'm glad you're here. There is a waiting room if you need to leave and come back in the room for technical reasons, then please give me a moment to admit you. There's closed captioning today, which I am happy about because yesterday I was typing the captions and it was very challenging because a lot of times, Stuart, I just wrote, etc. And so it's a lot better to have the third party product that we're using, rev.com, for the captioning.
I think most of my presentation could be etc. So.
etc. Let's see, we are recording this and the recordings will be available on the Grace is making a joke in chat. Okay, the recordings will be available on the BDA website as soon as the conference is, not as soon as the conference is over. It takes, give us about a couple weeks to get all of the recordings put together and edited and put on the website in an easy to understand way. But they will be available because you are a participant in the conference. Those recordings will be available to you as part of your conference registration. So you can go back and look at the notes or look at the chat or look at the text for the closed captioning to capture things that you want to hear a second time. If you have any problems, then turn your video off. And sometimes that helps. And I think those are all of the technical reminders that I wanted to tell you about. I'm just glad to see everyone and welcome to Sunday, the last day of the Biodynamic Conference. I recommend the keynote session that starts 30 minutes after Stuart with Benita Shah. She has been bringing biodynamics to a lot of farms in India, and it's fascinating. And we'll have a closing session together that I think will be meaningful and fun. All right, Stuart, I'm gonna mute myself and I can't wait for today's session. Thank you so much for being here and thank you so much for contributing all your knowledge and experience. So Stuart Lundy with his wife, Natalie McGill, they run Perennial Roots Farm. I actually, after our first session, I got out some of the tincture that you made of nettle because you made it sound like I better be, this is gonna solve everything. And so I have it right here and I've been taking it this weekend to get me through the big conference. So please check out his website, and he's a beautiful Facebook contributor on the Biodynamic community page as well. So thank you, Stuart.
All right. Well, I assume most people have been to the other two, or at least to yesterday's. This one, we're going to be dealing with the interface of water and earth. And that specifically is going to deal with soluble minerals and mineral salts. You'll remember this image. The relationship between earth and water occurs particularly within the root and within the brain. We need electrolytes in our brain in this kind of saline solution, or our nerves can't fire and the electricity can't spread through the brain. In the plant world, if there aren't enough salts in the soil, there's not conductivity in the entire neural network of the soil. It can't fire. So when a soil dries out, that's a problem because there's not enough of the water. There's just the mineral earth salt. And conversely, if you have too much water, it washes out all the salt. So you're going to have opposite problems depending on where you are. If you're in an area where it rains more than the water evaporates, you'll have an acidic soil. And this is most of everything from Michigan to Maine, all the way down the East Coast and all of the deep South. All of that is going to be relatively acidic soil. And only in that Midwestern part of the United States will you find these kind of spontaneously balancing soils, places where nature does everything for you. Now, worldwide, these places are relatively rare, so most of us are going to have to take steps to ensure fertility, at least for the kinds of crops that we want to see growing. But this particular theme today is going to be about these salts, the soluble aspects, and the issue of, salt excess or salt deficiency. Then again, this is not table salt. It's not sodium chloride, though that is one of many possible salts. This is anything that can dissolve into water. So again, there's that tripartite division of the human organism with the head, the heart, and the gut or hand. And today we're going to be dealing with the head. This is the rhizosphere, where mycelial networks join together, and Steiner himself says that plants under the soil are not distinct. You can't tell where one begins and where another ends. They form this kind of root mat, and they even fuse together, trading resources and nutrients. It's like one great collective brain, and you want it all to be contiguous so it all can communicate to each other. And mycelium are really an integral part to this. They can connect your garden plants to the pasture and the pasture to the forest, and then they're all trading nutrients, salts within the soil. You can find elements that were given to an herb in your garden that have moved their way into trees. There are some studies that use a radioactive isotope of carbon and watch it as it moves from the grasses, and then they find it in the top of a tree. And they know it wasn't there beforehand, but there's an amazing amount of conductivity and almost economic exchange between all of these plants. A great amount of sharing. In Stephen Herod Buhner's terms, these are neuronal roots, neuron-like roots. Paul Stamets popularized the idea of it being a neural network of the soil, and the alchemist Paracelsus referred to the root as a kind of brain of the plant. So I want to show this particular diagram, and it's one that I actually just drew this morning. I was like, this needs to be in here. So the plant, Steiner says, has a direct relationship to earth and water. And that confused me for a long time, but I realized the plant is lodged in the soil. So of course it does. It is rooted into the earth and limited to whatever water that earth supplies it. So it is anchored there. Steiner says that it breathes out air and warmth. It excretes air and warmth. And we can think of this concretely as it breathes out oxygen, which we as mammals need, but it also excretes nourishment, sugars as fruits, for example, which we then consume. And in the combustion, we return warmth back to the atmosphere, but we also return carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. The animal organism, by contrast, carries around its own earth and water with it. We're enveloped by warmth. We breathe in our own kind of air, but we carry water and earth within us. You can really think of the gut as we're carrying around, our own soil. We're not tethered simply to the earth. We can move, find our food, and return. But Steiner says we must always be near an earth and water source. So, in concrete terms, this is why animals always hang out near freshwater stream, but they also need access to salt. So there's often a salt lick source, which because we're constantly bringing in water, but we're also excreting it. And the fascinating part about animals is that we take in what plants have created, the oxygen and the sugars, and then we cause this kind of combustion, but it happens within us. And that warms us to a degree, but it's temporary, as our heat is always radiating out to the environment. What distinguishes mammals from other organisms is that we are able to maintain a differentiation between ourselves and the atmosphere, that we have a different temperature within ourselves than the atmosphere outside. If the warmth outside, and warmth is a spectrum of temperature, if the temperature outside us penetrates too deeply, we'll catch a cold. And warmth, again, is temperature is a measurement of rust of warmth. So you could really think of cold as a form of warmth. Whatever degree of temperature you have, it is a degree of warmth. And we as organisms must maintain that difference for everything to work correctly. This is a depiction of the continental United States. And if you look here, these lines are showing you the differentiation between different amounts of rainfall. Everything in blue is where the rainfall and the evaporation is, it's more than 100%, which is to say, as the evaporation is lower than the amount of water that comes into the earth. And whenever this happens, you're losing salts. It's washing the soil out, and it tends to make it acidic. When you get to the red zone, you have more evaporation than you have rainfall. This is from Dr. William Albrecht's essay you can find on the Soil and Health Library. And it's about the precipitation evaporation ratio. The ideal range is between 60% and 100%, right in that's the sweet spot. And this is where you get those spontaneously forming black earths that Rudolf Steiner talks about. And that's kind of the breadbasket of North America. The bison here loved this region for the same kind of region and reason, and helped contribute to that fertility. So depending on where you are in this kind of way of looking at soil, you'll need to think about water more in the redder zones. And this is not a perfect map. The data that contributed to this map didn't include Washington and Oregon, obviously. So, but you'll know what you have, and it's not hard to look it up. If you find yourself in that middle zone, you'll kind of find, gardening will seem a bit more like you put seeds in the ground and you walk away. It's almost where nature herself has performed her activities in such a way that it's perfect for human agriculture. Everywhere else, we're going to have to balance a little more severely, if that makes sense. We're just going to have to participate more actively. To sandy regions that are leaching out soils and acidic, you may need to bring some of the salt to bear. And what this really means is you're going to have to help alkalize your soil. And everything on the lime salt polarity, including ash, is on that alkalizing influence side. If you're on in an arid region, the salts don't leach out, and you end up accumulating mineral salts. And it's a very rich soil that if you can simply get the organic matter level up and keep it moist, you get incredible produce there. But in terms of what you have to balance, it's going to depend. So I'm going to talk about how it matters what form something is delivered to an organism. And I'm going to use a rather extreme example, but it's one that people may already be somewhat familiar with. This compound looks awfully similar to this compound. And it might take a second to see what the difference is, but it's simply how that the letter N there connects to the other side. And it's only a matter of a twist, whether it is left-handed or right-handed. If I depict this visually, you can see a bit more dramatically the difference. Now, human chemistry is left-handed. If you were to be given a right-handed sugar, you couldn't digest it. You couldn't use it for energy. Like, that's how incompatible it is. Yet the chemical formula for these two compounds is identical on paper. The only difference is whether it is right-handed or left-handed. This was discovered when people would fill a vat with a certain compound, the left-handed, and then the other, the right-handed, and pass light through it. The left-handed causes the light to turn left. The right-handed causes the light to turn right. So there's a fundamental difference here. Some of you may be familiar with the compound thalidomide, which caused serious birth defects. If it is a right-handed version, it is incompatible with human physiology and chemistry and is a terrible thing. But the left-handed version is almost entirely safe. And that's how extreme the differences are depending on how you deliver something. So when someone says water is water is water, or nitrogen is nitrogen is nitrogen, that's not entirely true, particularly if it's created in a synthetic way and the whole context isn't taken into consideration. The over-application of salts, particularly nitrogen as a salt, very quickly burns up organic matter, depletes the soil, and renders it dead. So it's not that the synthetic form absolutely is the problem, because that comes whenever we have lightning in a thunderstorm. That electrolyzes the air and produces nitrogen salts in a kind of chemical electric way. But that's not really what we're after when we're trying to grow our crops. In biodynamics, it's considered to be better to draw nitrogen from the animal world, if at all possible. So we take manure from a lactating cow, and this is really important. The cow, while lactating, is producing a very different kind of fermentation in her gut because she's seeking to produce more milk for her calf. It's a radically different process. We collect an ideal cow patty, which will look something like this. Some of you might say, well, that looks like a bull dropping. This is actually done after a photograph from Maria Thune's book, Results from the Biodynamic Planting and Sowing Calendar, which she depicts as the ideal cow patty. It should hold form, it should have a spiral around the outside, and rest while maintaining its form. We place this into cow horns, bury that over winter, and then unearth it, by which time it's totally transformed. It has no odor at all, and it just has a beautiful, sweet aroma, but no stink. I almost like to think of this as doing something a bit like what legumes do, which is they take astrality carried by nitrogen and they bring it into the soil. But in the 500, the horn manure, we're able to bypass the plant world and bring this astral influence directly into the soil. Steiner gives an example of putting a human being into a hermetically sealed chamber and then pulling all the nitrogen out of the chamber. The human being is fine, but you'll notice, he says, that nitrogen diffuses out of the human being and fills the chamber in order to restore the correct inner outer balance of nitrogen. I believe Steiner's use of that example is really a mirror image of what he's saying about the horn manure. The horn manure, by contrast, is a very strong concentration of nitrogenous astralized substance, and then it is contained. But over time, it too wants to restore a kind of balance, not between itself and the world outside the horn, but within the horn and the horn manure. So that what process occurs is that these odors, these scents, they keep trying to evaporate, but they can't. And then they're forced to cycle and recycle and cycle again until they become fixed within the horn. It's no coincidence that a lot of free living nitrogen fixing bacteria have been found in the horn manure. Now, whether we say that it's the bacteria that caused it, or rather that we created a space where that process could occur and the bacteria embody that process, it matters how we think of it. But we're able to bring this out to the soil. Why is this important in terms of salt and the soil and roots? It's significant because we are only fixing as much nitrogen as sugar is put into the soil, because this process depends on the carbon put into the soil, and they can only feed off that. If you apply artificial sources of nitrogen, you can have a problem where you feed too much, but then it doesn't rain enough, you can burn your plants. Or if you feed too little, they're not going to grow well. But in every case with synthetic nitrogen, you are burning up the present organic matter, and it's much healthier to have a living process dynamically playing with the carbon. Yes, someone says it's like smart nitrogen. Yes, it's such a dynamic process. So let's say you have a wet year. There's a lot of rain, but there's a lot of good sunlight. Your plants will create twice as much sugar in that season, and they'll send it into the soil. This horn manure process will respond in kind and supply them with their nitrogen. It's important to note that Charles Walters says that grasses can fix more nitrogen than legumes because of this relationship. That's really important. So what we're trying to create is a farm that is nitrogen independent. And for me, that's one of the revolutionary aspects of biodynamics. If you don't need to buy in nitrogen, well, what happens to the agrochemical business? The trouble is, if you're using synthetic nitrogen, you're killing your soil. And then, the only thing that seems to work is more synthetic nitrogen, because you kill off these populations when you burn off the carbon in the soil. So it's about this dynamic interplay. And I put it here in the salt slide because this is the living substitute for nitrogen applications. Steiner, in all of his preparations, he talks about stabilizing nitrogen and helping against the harmful effects of fructification and balancing it and settling down nitrogen. But he never talks about direct applications of nitrogen. And I think that's on purpose. It's that there is a spontaneous carbon nitrogen ratio within the soil. Steiner speaks of there being this strong affinity between nitrogen and the carbonaceous framework underlying everything. That's another way of saying what we now would call a carbon nitrogen ratio, but it's not one we have to balance. If you have carbon in the soil in an available form, like humus, which is more than 50% carbohydrates, it will feed these processes. We just have to determine what process is there and to initiate it with the preparations. I'll show you this short video, give you an idea of the stirring process and how that works. This is some of our corn manure. Now, this was manure that was buried in a horn over winter. You can see all the white actinomycetes colonies growing on the horn material. This is not bone, it's keratin. And this is totally transformed manure. Now, ideally, you won't see any of the parent material in here after a while because it continues to digest. But you're after this truly good colloidal humus that you can shape into a ball, and you can then peel apart and then reform again. That is really what we're after. And it's really a beautiful, sweet smelling thing. And you take, you don't really need much more than, I'd say, about this to treat your garden relative to its size. If you had an acre, I'd probably use a little more, maybe about this much. And you take that amount and you dissolve it in water. What I like to do is to start with a mason jar and some warm water. And I like to break it up into that and make sure that anything in it that's still solid, it's broken up nicely. And I will actually let this sit for a while, probably a few hours, even in the sunlight. You can see even it's very biologically active. Bubbles already forming. And I'll then shake this a bit, however you want, in order to kind of really get it broken up. And then I'll let this sit usually, like I said. Once that is set, I'm going to add it to a larger bucket. And you fill the bucket about halfway, regardless of what size you're going to stir. And we take this and this process is to help get non-soluble humus or rather into suspension because they refuse to dissolve. You get a vortex. Start on the outside, keep your wrist loose, and as you proceed, you move faster towards the center. So I'll show you. As I increase speed, I move to the center, and then you reverse. And the biodynamic recommendations is for this to be about an hour. I personally think follows the law of diminishing returns. You get probably 50% of the benefits from the first 20 minutes, 30% more in the next 20, and then 20% maybe in the last 20. If you stir it all, you're going to get considerably greater benefits. But the pre-soaking process I mentioned in the mason jar, starting and activating your sourdough starter. Better if you've done that.
Can you talk a little bit about how often we use this, what we use it for, when we use it?
This in particular is useful if you don't have a lot of animals on the farm. It's a way to kind of bring all the animal goodness that would be in your cow directly to the garden. Anytime that you're disturbing the soil, breaking up soil structure, so that's cultivating, tilling, whatever disturbance you're talking about, you add something like this back as a kind of biostimulant. You can say it's an apology to nature or a thank you, however you want to think about it. But simply adding a little bit of this out to the field adds an incredible amount of nourishment. Concretely in terms of the vitamins and nutrients synthesized by the gut of a ruminant, and it's the bacteria that's in there. But additionally, there's just so much going on in this that you need very little to stimulate an incredibly large amount. But in particular, I like to do this right before cultivation. So if you have weeds or cover crops that you're going to turn into the soil, that's a perfect time to spray. And then immediately you'll find that your cover crops digest faster and the soil improves at an accelerated rate.
And we also like to use this, we'll spray it behind the rotation of our animals where they last work. So as soon as we move the animals off one area, we'll spray it all in that area just to kind of kickstart the fermentation process.
Yeah, and you'll notice that if you're spraying out some sort of compost tea, biostimulant, or preparation like this, you're going to find that the manure doesn't smell nearly as much. Part of how to integrate your animals, whatever they may be, into your garden. And if you don't have them, it's a way to bring that kind of animal manure grazing impulse to a garden that is naturally devoid. Yeah, so someone had asked a couple questions in the chat. To attain proper transformation, sometimes it has to be buried for quite a long time, though Steiner indicated that in a cold climate, where he delivered it in what is now Poland, that the freezing process on the horns would actually be beneficial. My take on this is when you freeze, say, a tincture that's made out of distilled alcohol or something, ice will float on the top. The water can be separated out, and once there's not too much water, it will actually encourage and facilitate the fuller transformation. When we have unearthed the horns, we put them into crocks, and in those crocks, we add all of the compost preparations. We add yarrow, we add chamomile, we add nettles, we add oak bark, we add dandelion, and then we let that age again, making sure that it never dries out. You need to add moisture back to it to keep it, active, keep it alive. If you are in a warmer area where there is no direct winter impulse, you may need to engineer something that behaves more that way. Particularly if you're near the equator, the laws of nature are different there. You may need to engineer something that has more of a root cellar condition where it stays cooler and the roots of other plants cannot reach it. I've spoken to a number of people who have found that the horns they bury in tropical regions are often consumed by the roots of neighboring plants. Since we are subtropical here, I've noticed that has happened to us sometimes as well. So I'm more careful about where I bury it, and I try to make sure that roots do not get to it because they love it. I want to distribute it across the whole field, not just feed a couple. The issue about burying deeper, I only pause there, is that Steiner seems to indicate that we should bury it within the developed layer, the cultivated layer. So it should be enriched, it should be relatively full of humus, and not down to the fully mineralized zone. Though, if you look at the gesture, which I'm going to get to, of the dung beetle, they bury it very deep. Here's a quote from Paracelsus that I will read. There are many things lost in distillation, fixed by cohobation, and especially if these things to be fixed contain in them water. And you have heard of vitriol and alum, and so salt nitre, and other watery minerals may be fixed by cohobation. Many excrementitious things lose their stink in distillation, which indeed goeth forth in water. And to distill that down, he says many things are lost when you distill. But cohobation is an alchemical term that means a kind of closed distillation, where something distills, condenses, but isn't allowed to escape. He says that manure, excrement, loses its stink when you distill, but this prevents that, having it in a closed chamber. He even goes so far as to indicate nitrogen salts can be fixed by this process. Now, conventional modern chemistry tends to think that the alchemical cohabation is a pointless process. And if you're just looking at dead chemistry, you very well might be right. But when you're dealing with a living process within the realm of the living, that's where you start to understand what alchemy was really trying to talk about. Someone's asking what we do with all the extra horn product. Can you elaborate what you mean by the extra horn product? Do you mean the horns themselves or the contents? The contents. I use it pretty regularly, more than some might, and I also want to make more than I need in order to give it to friends and neighbors here and other farmers, and to ship it and sell it to somebody who wants their own. That's my impulse with it. I want to grow more than I need so that I can send fertilizer elsewhere. I reuse horns. Steiner indicated that you might be able to use them for 3 to 4 years, maybe recharge them by putting them over cows in a barn, like in the dairy barn. And the thing is, I found that the horns last a lot longer than that. And you can continue to get very good transformation for years after that. I know someone who's been using the same horns for 20 years. That may be extreme, but that's what that person was doing. I'm using them until they start to fall apart, at which point you know that it's not really doing anything anymore. Can you revitalize by mixing with new horn preps? I don't know. I haven't tried that. That might be interesting. Someone said that at a certain point you can consume matured horn manure like a supplement. While I don't usually recommend that people eat poop, or compost, at a certain point, if it is truly transformed and truly, like under a microscope, you can see nothing else, I do think it is safe for animals. I've tried putting the horn manure into the water for cattle and they'll drink it. But if you put even a small amount of manure that's fresh and stinks in water, the animals won't touch it. So they seem to know the difference there. Yeah, I don't mean to contradict anything Alex said. I don't have any particular experience with that. I always mix in some of my mature horn manure with the manure I put into horns, and I mix it for a full hour, like stirring kneading dough with shovels. You could use a cement mixer, but you mix it to homogenize it. I found if you stuff fresh manure into random horns from different cows, you end up with very inconsistent results. But if you knead it all together, you're chewing it again. It's like the cow chewing her cud one final time before it goes into the horn. It's not a necessary step, but I find it proves to be a beneficial step in my experience. Here's one of our dung beetles. Let's see if that plays. These can live for 3 to 5 years, which is kind of fun. Their activity in particular, is it going to play? I don't know if it's going to play. There we go. The activity of dung beetles is such that Charles Walters says that they can take 80 to 90% of the nitrogen from cow manure, ruminant manure, and bury it in the soil so you don't lose it to the atmosphere. And these magical creatures bury it as deep as 3 feet, and some bury it as deep as 4 meters. Like it's incredible how deep they go. So that's a tunnel. And then they've buried manure at the bottom. So there's a shaft that plant roots can follow. And then there's a reward at the bottom to incentivize it. So they're wonderful creatures. Sorry, I got excited there. I'll slow down. So this to me is very similar to the horn manure gesture for me. Steiner says when nitrogen is buried, it becomes sensitized. And I feel that's true of manures, which are carrying nitrogen. So there's a lot of wonderful imagery around this, which I think we could use. I bought in dung beetles. I brought some from a neighboring farm a number of miles away. And then I ordered in dung beetles from Florida because there weren't any here originally. And now they're all through the manure. And since we recently got cattle added, they're thrilled. They liked all the other kinds, but they really love the cow manure. I'll read this from Steiner. Beneath the grazing herd of cattle, the earth below is quickened to a joyful, vigorous life. There below, the elemental spirits rejoice because they are assured of their nourishment from the cosmos through the existence of the creatures grazing above them. This is what the animals bring. They take what would have volatilized and returned to the atmosphere, and they instead concentrate it. They take a lot. They absolutely do. They're chewing, they're breaking down sugars, but they're also increasing the surface area. As they do that, they put it through their different chambers where it cooks, almost passing from one season to the next. It's almost as if the grass has experienced an entire year under the sun by the time it exits the cow, one season for each rumen. And then it emerges, and if we compost it yet again, it's cooking it even more thoroughly, so it is even more available. And that brings it down and brings it into the soil. Whereas if you simply cut grass, mowed it, and the grass fell on the ground, in the sun, it would burn off, and almost everything would return to the air. So it is a very different thing when manure is dropped to the ground. They bring this concentration of fruit forces to the roots of the plants in a way that it would not happen without animals. When we bring compost, we do so because we want big tomatoes. We want sweet squash. And that gets back to that sulfur aspect of the first lecture that we went through. Someone asked, where do you keep your buried horns? In some kind of manure pile? Where do you put the beetles? The beetles I released behind where I was rotating my animals. So they had some of the older manure and they were safe from the chickens. Now there are so many that, yeah, I don't have to do anything. There is a rainbow colored dung beetle that I do want to bring to the farm. It used to be native here and I'd love to see it there, but it's native all across the continental United States. We have 40 acres here, 15 of which are wooded, 25 of which are for the rotation of the animals. A good site for bearing your horns would be to build a rituals place, mark it with totems and statues, celebratory features, because a lot of people lose their horns. And actually the first time anyone made the horn manure, they lost the horns. And Aaron Fried Pfeiffer was there digging and other people were digging, and Steiner's there with his walking stick getting frustrated. And he finally just he's leaving in a huff because people can't find it. They didn't mark it. And then they find it. So he's like, okay, thank goodness. And then he showed them how to stir it. But it's almost as if the rest of biodynamics, I'm not saying everybody, but there does seem to be this continuation of losing the preparations in the ground, which I think we can break that. We're almost to the centennial. It's time to change that. So we need like ritual spaces where we build them. They're well marked, they're permanent, they're a sacred space, and we don't lose it. Like we should at least, if we're going to do conscious agriculture, let's not forget where we put the preps. That's just a thought, you know. But how many cows? We currently have 10. One of which will be beef in the spring, which will mostly pay for the investment for the whole herd, which will bring us back to where we want to be. So here's a quote that I think we might have covered already, but I need to rephrase it so it makes sense in this sulfur, mercury, salt way. Steiner says, heaven does not voluntarily bestow phosphorus, potassium salts, or lime in the right way to the soil. So you must work the earth and fertilize it in the right way. Now, if we keep in mind when Steiner says phosphorus, that he means often the flowering pole and the sulfur pole of combusted materials, what he's saying is very similar to what Wallerius was saying. And if I change the terms only slightly, it would say that heaven does not voluntarily bestow alchemical sulfur or salt, the lime pole, in the right way to the soil. So we must balance these two things. On the one hand, we must provide combustible materials like humus and aged manure. And then conversely, we must also consider the salt pole, which means balancing pH. So when Steiner says we need to think about lime, really he's talking about all of the salts and all of the pH balancing. Someone said, they just realized that our frost line goes beyond 6 feet into the earth. Do I need to bury below that? No. You only need to bury it, basically put it 2 feet down. It's fine if it freezes. That would even benefit it because it would further astralize the substance. The frost thaw action would really be beneficial because it's like another kind of chewing. You know how if you leave something in the freezer too long, it gets freezer burn? That doesn't taste good to us, but in terms of breaking down the original substance in the horn, it will help bring it to humus in a way that is not dissimilar to a hot compost, if that makes sense. The difference being that everything is kept within the horn, but both freezing and cooking are exposures to different kinds of warmths that will that astralize the substance. It's in different ways, but they're both breaking down what was built up. So I think I mentioned before that if you stirred water, like distilled water, out in the open and kept it flowing, it would continuously absorb substance from the air because it wants to become the ocean. It not only wants to go downhill, it wants to draw into itself salts because it's hungry water when it's distilled. For places that have acidic soil conditions, as long as you don't have a sodium excess, sea salt is a wonderful and sustainable way to bring these electrolytes, the salts, the conductivity back to the soil. There are a number of sources. Redmond salt is an ancient sea salt deposit. I think it's out in Utah. It has a typical red color, so there's more iron. C90 is from the Baja region, where they dehydrate salts, but it also contains over, I think, 20,000 organic compounds. So it's a wonderful supplement for just that. I use the C90 as my salt supply for my cattle, and I also use that in the garden. You don't need a lot. I believe the application rates are about 50 pounds per acre, but this is specifically when you're in an acidic condition with a low cation exchange capacity probably, and you need to restore conductivity. You don't need a lot. Someone is asking, does the horn need to be buried 2 feet? No, bury it as deep as you can. That's the general principle. And make sure it's surrounded by good humus. Steiner says that it should not be too sandy. It should not be too clayey. So for me, that really means it should be filled with good humus. And so, yeah, in India, I know there's a habit of mixing the soil where you bury the preparations with 50% good finished like cow manure compost. I think that's a very good practice. Yes, adding compost to native soil so that it basically looks like, yeah, manure compost with some soil in it. If you have a sodium excess, sea crop is an alchemically separated version of sea salts where 99% or 90 something percent of the sodium has been removed. So that's a really good option for places that already have enough sodium. Now, human blood is already 25% seawater. We came from the ocean, we'll return to the ocean again. So sea salt is a very sustainable way to bring things back. Now, you don't want any old sea salt. All of the world's pollution, including the lead pollution, is in about the top 50 feet of water, and it's only slowly percolating down. So the best sources of sea salt will actually reach down below that and pull from the clean water. And that's where like C90 comes from. Good aromatic plants for adding to compost are any that you like and any that grow well there and any that pollinators and insects really like. I mean, just think lavender, rosemary, calendula, anything you could possibly think of that you might use um, for yourself. Think of the compost pile might need it. If you have like really humid, damp, foggy air, um, then you should think, well, what are the herbs that are good, that help with lung conditions of pneumonia? C90, S, the second one. C like the ocean, yes. And a good way you can put it through your compost pile first if you want to make sure it's, a very gentle application to the field. Now, eggshells. If anybody has eggshells and they have chickens, this is a good source of soluble calcium. Calcium is pretty hard to get into solution. So there are some tricks to do that. One is eggshells. Since it's already within the realm of the living, it's not quite like bone, and it has such surface area, it's easier to extract. Some people may know the trick of saving the water when you boil eggs. That has a lot of good dissolved calcium. When tomatoes are growing quickly early in the season, they're growing faster than they're finding calcium in the soil usually. And if you water them regularly with eggshell water, you'll have far fewer problems with blossom end rot on those initial tomatoes. And that's a really good trick. If you want them to be more easily assimilated, toast them first. What you really make is a kind of quicklime out of eggshells yourself. And this is a sustainable way to do some of your own liming, at least at the doses that plants need, which is relatively homeopathic, not like literally homeopathic, but at such trace amounts, they don't need much as long as it really gets into solution. When people recommend applying, a lot of lime to your field, you have to do that because so little of it is actually available to plants. So what actually makes it to the plant is only a part per million or part per 100,000. So given the amount that you apply, it is homeopathic like. It's not true homeopathy in terms of successive dilutions, but in terms of the raw material you apply, very little of it goes to the plants. Yes, someone's mentioning Korean natural farming extracts in vinegar to make calcium more available in soluble form. It's a great method as well. It really is. Someone's asking, do you mean to add aromatic plants when fresh and growing or after blooming and dry before winter? Ideally, while they're still in the perfect state for human medicine. That would be the best point. You could do them when they're spent, but if you pick them fresh in order to regenerate the plants, you can then put them into the compost pile. So fresh herbs, fresh flowers, directly in the compost pile. It's a wonderful way to bring that sulfur aspect into play. This here is beryl compound. Maria Thun specifically developed the beryl compound because of radiation in the Chernobyl fallout zone. What was being found was that radioactive isotope of strontium was being mistaken by plants for calcium. And it would draw that up into the plant, causing all sorts of confusion. But this recipe mixes cow manure together with eggshells and basalt. And the result is soil treated with beryl compound, she found, actually would still remain radioactive, but the plants and the vegetables above ground would not be radioactive. And that's pretty significant. And that's a very specific calcium-related preparation. No, you don't have to peel the inner membrane off. And the toasting makes the eggs far more easily assimilated into the soil. I've seen people who've applied raw eggshells in their garden, and you'll see the eggshells there years later, or beryl compound, entire chunks of eggs are left in there. So if you toast the eggshells first, it's very easy to pulverize them. They almost shatter, and it just makes it much easier to then make the beryl compound, in my experience. Here is all right. Here's the recipe in the chat. Should really think that the beryl compound will take you an hour or so, but once you've made it, the retail value of it would be about $1,600, which for an hour or two's labor, that's probably some of the most productive time you can spend. And you end up with enough to treat a couple hundred acres, or 1 acre a couple hundred times. So I strongly recommend making at least one of those. Someone's asking whether this will work in places where there have been pesticides, chemical fertilizers too. It's worth trying. That's one of those things I hinted at earlier, is the more biologically active we can make any soil, the more we're breaking down. And you're just weathering everything in the soil, including those chemicals, even including plastics. Like the things that true living processes can do, it's really mind-boggling. So I'm going to do a little summary slide here. So we have fire or warmth, we have air, we have water, and we have earth. Sulfur is the mediation between air and fire. And you can think of a candle as a good example for this, which burns wax, produces light and warmth. But these are the combustible materials. And this is really the key area that agriculture tends to be lacking. A lot of people will refer to this part as carbon sequestration, but it's way more fun this way. It's way more dynamic, and you understand why we're moving in that direction. The beryl compound itself is not a substitute for horn manure, but it is a good way to use surplus manure. And it's it's an ideal foliar spray for brassicas. It helps them grow bigger and lusher, but it doesn't make them stink, both in cooking and in terms of stinking and attracting cabbage moth. It makes them, they fly under the radar, so to speak, but it's not quite a separate. Building bricks, just standard, just a standard brick. That's what I've used. Red ones. I don't have a picture here, but I wish I did. I thought I was going to, but yeah, you just use like chimney bricks. Yep. So if we extend this, the mediation between air and water, it's like our lungs. That is the mercury process, which mediates all of these things. It's what it carries dissolved minerals and it dissolves oils. This is something the watery aspect can do a little bit of both, and that's what makes it kind of it just so central to agriculture. And whether or not we have enough rain or enough water is probably the single most limiting factor to whether we can grow something. And yeah, that's the middle. And then what we've been talking about today is primarily dealing with the salt, which is this is the mediation between the watery earth, and this is what can crystallize and dissolve one way or another. This is also where it's easiest to make mistakes. If you apply too much boron, you can ruin your entire garden because you need so little. You need no more than a few parts per million. Now, there are times where there is simply a key salt missing from the life process. I believe it was in portions of Australia, which were simply missing molybdenum, and they sprayed it with helicopters at, I think, parts per billion, and the entire ecosystem woke up because it was just simply lacking that key element at really at a homeopathic dose, but it just wasn't there in the parent material. But once it was there, everything could wake up. But it's really easy to mess up here, and that's why I saved it kind of for last. Mineral balancing is important. pH balancing is important, but it's also the harshest because you're dealing with these dead things, and that's really touchy. And particularly when Steiner says we should remain within the realm of the living. So this is a picture of biochar. We heard a little bit about this yesterday in the keynote, and for me, biochar's main function is not carbon sequestration. There's a little of that, sure, but I don't think of it as the big solution. I think of it as increasing the surface area in the soil, increasing the liminal space, the amount of thresholds in the soil. Some people might say cation exchange capacity, but I like liminal because that's where life thrives, always on the thresholds. Someone's asking, do we test soil regularly and amend accordingly, or stick to your biodynamic application? So forth. We tested more early on, and then as things have progressed, we've needed less and less of that. I'm moving more to seeing that if you can keep the pH balanced and focus on certain key trace minerals, you can do very well. Yeah, Veronica's saying biologically active soils will create mineral resiliency as well. This is true. I was trying to find a picture this morning in a book. It's an Indian method of farming that focuses on cow manure, particularly dairy cow manure, and it has a diagram showing the concentration of minerals. The deeper you get, the more minerals there are. So if you can deep rip and the roots of your plants can get down there, they'll have access to minerals that are not in your soil test. That's very important. In addition to that, there's a book called Humus, what is it? Humus and Fertile Soils or something by Erhard Henning. And he writes that plants can create hydrochloric and hydrofluoric acid. Like literally, the stomach acid we produce, the roots of plants can also produce. That is able to dissolve a lot more than we think, but they can only produce that if they're healthy enough. And that's about bringing the right impulse there. The 500 horn manure, good manure compost, and letting them get down into the soil. Hydrofluoric acid is actually strong enough to dissolve quartz crystals. Like it's pretty harsh stuff. So they can dissolve raw parent material. Thank you, Georgia. Yes, secret of fertile soils, humus as the guardian of the fundamentals of life, which by the time you get to the end of the book, you find out, oh, this guy's biodynamic. Of course, now it makes sense. But it's a very good book. It's only recently translated into English, I think a few years ago. But I highly recommend that book. So we're moving into another form of salt, so to speak. Everything that is left behind, as Paracelsus says, he calls salt. Steiner says, every plant and being carries within itself the germ of its own annihilation. Just as water is a requirement for fertility on the one hand, so fire is destroyer of fertility. Fire consumes fertility. Because seed power obviously continues to work after it is sown, so too the seed ash has a similar far-reaching effect of annihilation. Steiner recommends that we burn the weed seeds in order to stop future weeds from producing viable seeds. If you're looking to buy biochar, look at Rock Dust Local. Additionally, you can look up Kon-Tiki Kiln for making your own. Bamboo makes excellent biochar, so we have a really good use for that. So if you have biochar, yeah, get that. And it's a great way to use it. So Steiner says you could perhaps let seeds or pests rot for a more thorough effect, but it may be difficult to collect the decomposition products. Our goal is to bring about this kind of combustion. And now we're getting to the ash, yes. What happens here is what's left behind is the alchemical salt. This is very different, and what we've intentionally done by burning is the sulfur has been destroyed and radiated as heat. When we burn wood, the sulfur in it is being destroyed and it's radiating heat. What is left behind has no moisture, and it's just that alkaline salt pole. Here's a visual depiction of burning a pest. Having burned it, it becomes its opposite. Now, how does this fit in the sulfur, mercury, salt perspective? I will read this for you. This is from Paracelsus. He says, by alchemical means, we may create a magnetic attraction in the astral form, so that it will attract from the elements those principles which it possessed before its mortification and incorporate them. My take on this is that when you burn the seed, you expel the germ, the oil, whatever moisture it held, and it's left behind with the unique salts for that seed. And those salts, like distilled water, are hungry. They're hungry for vitality in the soil, but they're also hungry for the particular unique sulfur to that plant. Every plant has a unique essential oil. Likewise, every seed has a unique essential oil in it. The germ is different. The salt, the ash left behind, is hungry for that in the soil and then binds it. It's almost as if there is a spiritual plant process that continues in the soil. The ash you spread seeks out mercurial elements, binds that to itself, and then finds the sulfur and fixes to that. The result is you rob the soil of the unique type of sulfur process that that weed needs to produce viable seeds. It does not kill the weeds, it allows them to grow. It simply robs the seed of its viability. And that's all. And this can be used directly in your compost in order to pull those weed seed forces out of it, or it can be spread through your garden. Someone asks, how much does the intention and idea of burning a substance to energetically rid yourself of what was a renewal or a clean state have to do with this process? Oh, I'm sure there's a good degree of that involved. If you're, it is a ritual. You're doing a ritual burning of something. You're saying, bye-bye. I'm trying to give an alchemical explanation with these three elements. But yes, if you just were to burn it and walk away from it, that wouldn't have the same strength, certainly in terms of intention. But yeah, in nature, that's the thing. If you put seeds in your compost pile and it heats up and it kills the seed, well, then you still have in the pile the unique salt and the unique sulfur. So that has a neutral effect. So what this does is it actually expels the unique sulfur in order to create a very hungry ash that then draws to itself that sulfur. Yeah, if you have persisting roots, now that's important. I'm glad someone brought up roots. If a plant can reproduce by a part other than the seed, burn that part as well. So something like Japanese knotweed can reproduce by seed or stem or root or leaf. You can burn any element of that, but the seed has the most of what you're after, if that makes sense. The root, though, would be a particularly interesting way. I've been experimenting with burning the rhizomes of bamboo in order to try to create a perimeter to contain it where I want it. But it's too early for me to say because I don't have a very fast growing bamboo. So yes, and summarizing in a slightly different way, the sulfur is the combustible manures, organic matter, compost, essential oils. But how do you get essential oils into the ground when they want to float up and away? There's this alchemical inversion that we do, this reversal. And that's kind of the magic of compost and fertilizers and even of manure. It brings something into the soil that otherwise would have just wanted to go back out to the universe. Mercury again, condensation, evaporation, airflow, everything in the middle dealing with circulation. And then the salt is the lime, your pH balancing, whether plus or minus, mineral salts, ash, and peppers. The ash is going to be more suitable for acid soils because of its alkalizing effect. You may be able to neutralize its effect if you were to combine it with enough vegetable material that was fermenting in an acidic way. You might consider a Korean natural farming acid-based ferment to help neutralize that. But I've been playing with an idea of that acid ferments would be particularly useful for an alkaline soil and alkaline ferments for an acid soil. If you look at alkaline ferments, like with beans, fish, like legumes, like I said, you're going to have more of that baking soda and vinegar reaction in the soil. It will, and conversely, if you have an alkaline soil and you use acid-based ferments, you're going to stimulate quite an activity in that soil. someone asked, did Rudolf Steiner talk about healthy plants like fully mineralized and balanced plants or animals less susceptible or protected from pests, parasites, and diseases? Not directly, though he did indicate that if animals are allowed to follow their instincts, they will be healthier. Animals have a tendency towards disease, which is different from plants. Plants, for Steiner, have no true diseases. And this is because to be diseased, you have to have, in Steiner's mind, that internalized astral body, which if I were to, let's see, where was it? If we were to go back to this, plants, their warmth and their air, their atmosphere is outside them. They grow relative to the environment, relative to the season, but they have to be warmed from outside. The animal, and this goes all the way to the honeybee, is able to generate its own warmth from what it eats and is able to maintain that difference. But because we have that internalized climate, we can have storms within inside ourselves, whereas the plant, which is only an internalized etheric body, the environment is the source of its disease, if that makes sense. Even far more so than with the animal. So if you have disease symptoms in the plant, it's an environmental issue because the plant is a pure, faithful expression of the conditions of the soil and the environment and the cosmos. Whereas the animal has its own willful impulse, which may or may not have what it needs in the area. It's a different thing. But plants, in Steiner's view, given the right conditions, shouldn't have pests be a real problem, nor should they have diseases either. And that's what this has been about. It's providing that environment, bringing sulfur to the soil so there are combustible materials for it to grow. That in turn allows the leaves to fill out, and then we cultivate the right kind of airflow around them, the right amount of water, and then they're able to receive cosmic forces and substance from the environment. To give vitality back to old fruit trees, you should use the biodynamic tree paste in part, which is a mixture of clay and manure and some of the preparations. A good thing to add there is the fermented equisetum decoction as an antifungal aspect. But if you go around to the drip line of the tree, you can dig small holes and stir a large batch of the preparation 500 with ideally all of the different compost preparations, and then pour all of that in. And we're talking gallons upon gallons. So just soak that drip line. What you're really trying to do is restore that stimulus to the tree so that when it sends sugars into the soil, it's able to actually get back nitrogen from that impulse. And you restore that dynamism. In an ideal world, the plant shouldn't be expressing disease symptoms, and neither should animals be really carrying a bad parasite load. There may be parasites, but they shouldn't be exhibiting parasite symptoms, yes. How do you allow instinctual living with your rabbits? Yeah, in that case, I don't. I would like to build a rabbit warren. Right now, I have them in cages. I tried rotating them on the ground, which worked, but I found that they were always terrified because being exposed on all sides is not a comfortable feeling when there are predators all around. So I have them up off the ground, currently in cages. I bring them hay, and I bring them weeds, and we also feed them barley fodder that we grow fresh every day. So they're getting as close as I can create there before I can find the time, energy, or money to build a rabbit warren, which I'd like. I'd like to build a rabbit warren with an underground home, and then have a rotational system based off that center, where they graze this section, then I close them off, then they graze this one, I close them off, but they're always living in the same den. That's in an ideal world. I'm not there yet. I'd like to approach that, but I just haven't made it happen yet. Someone asked, after you inoculate your compost with preps, does it have a max time to get used? Well, when you start to see earthworms showing up in your compost pile, they're breaking it down even further. It's about time to use it. That's a good indicator to me, is that if worms are moving through your pile, it's safe to put on your plants. It's a good idea to go ahead and distribute it, because otherwise they'll gobble it all up for themselves. We do feed sprouted grains. I don't use soy, so we have whatever is available locally from an organic farmer I have a relationship with here. The purpose of rabbits biodynamically is rabbit meat. They have good manure, and if you have a urine diverter or a manure diverter, like some fiberglass screening that works like a chute, you can direct all the dropping manure into a worm bin. The urine goes elsewhere, and then the worms thrive. Urine and worms don't mix well, so you want just the dry feces to fall in one area. I've tried magnets in the past for structuring water. I've also used the coiled wire that I mentioned in the last lecture. And there are some vortex attachments you can put onto your hoses. Those I'm trying to get 3D printed so I can just make as many as I like. Rabbit manure is pretty harsh. Some people say it's safe enough, you can apply it directly. If it's on the surface, yeah, that's true. But if you put it into the soil, it's a pretty hot and it's a pretty dry manure. So it's more on the airy, hot side of things, not because of the harsh amount of nitrogen, but the structure of the manure itself. If you want to learn what element a manure or compost ingredient belongs to, make a giant pile of nothing but it. I did that once with rabbit manure. I made a big pallet-sized pile, and the entire outside layer turns into beautiful soil. But then as you get deeper, it's still manure in the middle. Like it's very dry, but only the outside layer that was kept getting consistently watered transformed. So if you pile pure pig manure, it will just stink. If you pile good cow manure, it can decompose beautifully, like into almost spontaneous compost. If you pile chicken manure high enough, it can catch on fire. Like it's actually that hot. And that's actually the same with green grass clippings, not because there's so much nitrogen, but there's so much air. It's like kindling. So we have to think dynamically about what it means for something to be hot. For the compost pile, it may not be because it brings fire, but that there's so much airy surface area that the combustion reaction accelerates. Rabbit manure would be really good, particularly composted for berries and things that traditionally like the woodland edge manure. Yes, that would be a good mix. You can mix them together. No, that'd be a great thing to do. And I would personally mix in a way that you put the coldest and wettest on the top. So your pig manure, goose manure, duck manure, cow manure even. And then your drier stuff, you put a little lower down so that as the compost pile gets rain, the cold stuff leaches down and the warm stuff warms the top. And you have this kind of dynamic interplay between the top and the bottom. Yes, because I have a mixed flock, we put out everything and they choose what they eat. Yep. And I'm going to install a hay feeder for the cattle, but that the sheep can't reach, just so I can guarantee that the cows can have theirs, the sheep can have theirs. So yeah, any more questions? I know it's a lot, but yeah. For alkaline soils, you'll be using sulfates instead of lime probably. But again, the pH balancing really does still belong to this salt polarity. Could you, oh, right down the top. Yeah, whenever there's an anaerobic fermentation of something, in Pfeiffer's research, he found that the animal's mood was negatively affected. They would become more hostile, more agitated. He preferred dry hay. I would experiment for yourself to find out, but that was his personal prejudice and his extensive research. And I tend to take what he says. I value what he says, even if I end up sometimes disagreeing or finding a local. A good acid ferment. Sauerkraut. Here's a fun recipe that anybody can make. If you can get some cow manure and some sea salt, you can ferment the two together and you can make a sauerkraut out of cow manure. And that is a wonderful acid fermentation. It's very easy to do. And the result is this super concentrate of all the cow juices, the cow process, and all of the metabolic byproducts. And it's pretty amazing. Like, I'm not saying it replaces the 500, but it's really good. You might not want to drink it, but yes, that would be a lactic fermentation. And the salt in there makes sure that it goes the acid direction. And you just leave that for a few months. And by the time it no longer smells bad, it's probably pretty good for applying to the soil. And the nice part about the cows is we don't really share a lot of parasites or even diseases with them. So that's why ruminant manure is kind of high up in the biodynamic list, whereas pig manure, probably don't want to use that. And human waste, yeah, avoid that if you can. Someone says, yeah, we have a spent brewery near us, and they donate their spent grains, and everyone loves it. We use spent brewery grains as well, but we put those through the secondary acidic ferment. So we put them in barrels. We fill the barrels with water and add sea salt and let those ferment for at least 2 weeks before we give them to the ruminants. The result is it's far more digestible. We've never had a problem with bloat since we did that. When we gave them fresh, it wasn't as good, but this breaks down more of the sugars in it and creates more of the sauerkraut goodness. So I'm a big fan of using spent brewery grains. I put them through a process with the sea salt, water soak, and I add biodynamic preparations too. So that's neat.
Stuart, we got to a place where I feel like you've answered 900 questions about everything from, human health to, tropical to really freezing cold earth. Oh my gosh, your knowledge and just I know we all really respect the amount of time you have spent really understanding things experientially and through books and through talking to other people. So if there's anything else you want to leave us with, I hope you will. And then maybe I can unmute everyone so we can tell you thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
No, I don't think I have anything in particular. I think I'm out of words. So not really, but yeah, if you have more questions, I do other webinars. I'm doing a study group this winter. I have a new translation of the agriculture course that I've done from German, which has over 400 footnotes referencing Steiner's other works, Alchemists, just to try to provide more context. But yeah, I do consultations, workshops, travel for all of that. So yeah, check it out.
And Stuart has done lots of great workshops with the Biodynamic Association, and we're just really grateful to have you in this community. I'm really grateful to have you as a mentor and a teacher. So thank you, Stuart. Thanks everybody for being here. I'll unmute you and you can say thank you and
I just wanted to take this.
Thanks,
Thank
Stuart.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
Stuart.
so much,
you.
Stuart. He's a
Bye.
great artist as well.
So much, Stephen.
Thank you, Stuart.
Big thanks, Stuart.
Hello.
Thank you.
You're a great artist.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you, Stuart.
gracias a todos. Thank you.
And you're a great artist. It helps explain the concepts. I wanted to know if you wrote a book or did you translate the Steiner agriculture course?
Natalie and I have translated a new version of Steiner's agriculture course. Yeah, and right now I've done it, I've edited it, but it's not finished for publication. But we're using that for our study group, which has been quite fruitful. I think we had 25 people last time. We have nearly that many already signed up, but it'll be intensive through, I say January through March. I think that's when we'll read it all. Yeah.
Did you trans or edit the English or do you speak German? You translated from German.
Well, I translated it from German because one day I realized that there was an error in the English because I could just see the idea was wrong. And I went to the German, and I can't speak German, but I can muddle my way through it. And then I looked at it and asked a native speaker of German, I'm like, what does this mean? And I'm like, I think this is wrong. And they said, yeah, you're right. And I'm like, okay, I need to just do this myself because I was seeing where I could see the errors through the text and understand that the concept wasn't coming through. But I think being a farmer makes me see where they're missing an agricultural reference, because there have been always farmers advising the translation, but what if someone doesn't realize that this is about manure here, or this is about beets over here? It adds a little bit of confusion that I'm hoping to help clarify. But yeah, it's a new translation that we've done, and I have, like I said, over 400 footnotes directing to Steiner's other works, Alchemists, trying to integrate it so that it's useful for farmers. I'm trying to put it into plain language without being unfaithful to what Steiner was trying to say.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because maybe what happened was an intellectual translated the German to the English that was not a farmer. So you're a biodynamic farmer. So thank you for that work. So I'm looking forward to that edition. And I'll just look at someone asked, is it through Biodynamics or through your
It's through our website. If you go to the consultation tab on the website, the study group is listed there. And yeah, you're able to sign up. If you did, it would continue to, it would just do a recurring payment once a week until there's going to be 9 sessions, but it'll start whenever you sign up. So if you sign up now, it would start now and then end in 9 weeks, but then the group will start in January. So.
Oh, it's not live?
No, it will be live. It will be.
Recorded.
No.
Oh,
but the
okay.
payments just start whenever you sign up.
Got it. Thank you so much. And you're a great artist. I need to say that again.
Thank you.
The concepts sometimes are best described with a drawing, And also, isn't I forget the name, but it's like an infinity symbol where one side is smaller and one side is larger.
The lemniscate.
Yes, I think that could have been a little bit more. It looked like the infinity symbol there. I go, no, it's the wrong one. But you got it. You got it. Maybe I didn't see the differentiation on each side as much. But thank you for all that artwork. It's just phenomenal. The watercolors is just beautiful.
All right. Well, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Hey, Stuart, I just
Steve?
wanted to express gratitude on behalf of the board of the Biodynamic Association, and also just express how much of an honor it's been to spend time in relation in this paradigm with you and the teaching perspective that you offer. Just so grateful as a person of color, as an indigenous person, to have such a holistic perspective of biodynamics that you bring to the table and you offer. You're a one of a kind human being, and thank you for your wisdom every day.
Thank you, Jose Luis.
Thanks, everybody. I think I'll go ahead and close our session. And I look forward to seeing your beautiful faces in Benita Shaw's keynote that starts in 20 minutes. The session starts. And much appreciation to the interpreters and to Grace. I'm so glad that we could offer this session in Spanish. I feel like it was the perfect thing to do. Do you want to go? Thank you, Stuart. Bye, everybody. See you soon.